June 6, 1944. At the first light of dawn, a German artillery officer stood inside a concrete observation post overlooking the Normandy coast. He raised his binoculars as he had done many times before. But this time, the sea was gone. Where the gray waters of the English Channel should have been, he saw only steel. Warships, transports, landing craft, layer after layer, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other, a silent, moving wall of metal pushing steadily toward the shore. Nearly 7,000 Allied ships from 8 nations advancing as one. In that instant, every assumption he had been told collapsed. This was not a raid. This was not a limited landing. This was an industrial force made visible. Behind each ship, he no longer imagined sailors or soldiers. He imagined factories, assembly lines, oil fields, an entire continent's production capacity now concentrated into a single morning. His battery would fire the first German shells of the day, but as he watched the armada grow larger and darker across the water, he understood a truth he could not say aloud. Germany had not lost the battle on this beach. Germany had lost the war long before this moment, in the factories and ocean away. This film takes you back to that morning, through German eyes, into the bunkers, the gun positions, and the shattered expectations. To witness how a single horizon filled with ships revealed the end of one era of warfare and the beginning of another. June 6, 1944. The first hour of daylight had not yet broken fully across the Normandy coastline, yet the German defenders stationed along the cliffs felt a tension they could not explain. For weeks they had lived in a state of constant alerts, false alarms, aircraft passing overhead, minor skirmishes in the channel. Nothing had ever come of it. Nothing ever changed. But that morning was different. Even before the horizon revealed its secret, the air felt heavier. Something vast was moving. Major Werner Pluskat of the 352nd Artillery Regiment stood inside his observation bunker, a concrete shell perched 300 feet above Omaha Beach. He had not slept during the night. Too many aircraft had passed overhead. Too much radio chatter. Too many unusual signs. He had served on the Eastern Front. He had survived the frozen wastes of Russia, the endless barrages, the night assaults, the feeling of being swallowed by a force far larger than anything he could influence. He understood war, but nothing in his experience prepared him for what he was about to see. When the first thin line of dawn touched the water, he raised his binoculars, and the sea changed. Not the tide, not the weather, not a shadow, something far greater. A dark band stretched across the horizon, at first a faint smear, then a mass, then a wall. As the light strengthened, shapes began to form. Blocks, angles, silhouettes, ships, more ships, rows of them, hundreds, then thousands. An entire floating metropolis moving silently out of the mist. Pluskat lowered his binoculars as if refusing to believe his own vision. He looked again. The sight did not change. It grew sharper. It grew undeniable. The English Channel, the protective moat Germany believed would shield Fortress Europe, had transformed into an industrial conveyor belt aimed directly at the Normandy coast. At Kreisee Battery, Oberleutnant Walter Omsen witnessed the same thing. He had been awake for hours, reviewing reports, listening to the distant hum of engines at sea. His post was one of the closest to the invasion route. When he brought his Zeiss rangefinder to bear, the truth struck him with a force greater than any artillery shell. From left to right, from horizon to horizon, the sea was filled with steel. Dark silhouettes packed tightly together, stretching farther than the human eye could measure. Later, official records would confirm the number, 6,939 vessels. A combined naval force larger than any assembled in human history. But to the men on the cliffs, numbers did not matter. The scale itself crushed their spirits. This was not an invasion. This was a verdict. Omsen checked his watch. 5:52 a.m. The order arrived. Open fire. 3 minutes later, his check-made 210mm cannons fired the first German shells of D-Day. Their trajectories arced in thin trails over the water, but the shells were so insignificant against the scale of the armada that it felt like throwing handfuls of gravel at a tidal wave. Omsen knew it. Pluskat knew it. Every German defender who laid eyes on that horizon knew it. The invasion fleet wasn't just overwhelming, it was impossible. No training manual had prepared them for this. No briefing had warned them. No estimate had come close. While the men on the cliffs saw the truth with their own eyes, the German command structure refused to accept it. At 1:20 a.m., the 7th Army had received reports of massive parachute drops across Normandy. 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions scattered behind German lines. But even that had not convinced the generals that the invasion had begun. To them, it was only a diversion, a raid meant to confuse. In the inland headquarters of Army Group B, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel monitored the incoming signals. Disturbing patterns emerged. Increased radio traffic. Long-range bombers flying deeper into France. Paratrooper landings on an unprecedented scale. Rommel, the commander of Army Group B, was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. He had left his post the previous day because the weather forecast promised heavy seas and strong winds. Conditions unsuitable for an amphibious invasion. He was certain the Allies would not attack. This conviction proved fatal. All across the German chain of command, doctrine overrode reality. Logic overrode instinct. Expectation overrode observation. When Pluscat called headquarters and said, "I see hundreds of ships," no, thousands. They told him the weather made that impossible. When he insisted the fleet fill the sea, they told him to remain calm and continue observing. When he said, "This is the invasion," they dismissed him. It was not just disbelief. It was a physiological inability to comprehend what the Allies had built. The German High Command had assumed the Allies might be capable of landing 20 divisions supported by perhaps 3,000 vessels. They believed this because Germany could not have assembled more than that. They projected their own limits onto their enemy. They had no concept of what a fully mobilized industrial superpower could achieve. The men on the cliffs did not yet understand what they were truly seeing. They saw ships, but the ships were only the surface. Behind those ships were factories. Behind the factories were assembly lines. Behind the assembly lines were millions of workers. By 1944, American industry was producing 96,000 aircraft per year, 29,000 tanks per year, 650,000 military trucks per year. Germany, by comparison, produced 39,000 aircraft, peak monthly tank output of only 1,854, 68,000 military trucks. Across every category, the Allies outproduced Germany by ratios of 5-1, 6-1, and even 10-1. And all of that production was visible in one sweeping moment on June 6th, pressed into a single unstoppable line of ships. In every bunker, in every trench, German soldiers felt the same realization sink into their bones. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an entire industrial system. As the Armada approached, German artillery opened fire. Omsen's battery hit the destroyer USS Corey, the only American destroyer lost on D-Day. But for every hit the Germans scored, 100 ships sailed unharmed. No gap appeared in the landing waves. No sign of weakness emerged. It was like shooting into the side of a mountain. At 5:30 a.m., Allied battleships and cruisers opened fire in return. USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from its 14-inch guns in the first hour. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds, more explosive power than some German artillery regiments possessed in their entire ammunition stockpile. The naval barrage shook the German fortifications to their foundations. Concrete cracked. Dust fell from ceilings. Even deep bunkers felt like they were being lifted and dropped again by invisible hands. Then came the sky. At 6 a.m., thousands of Allied aircraft filled the airspace over Normandy. Fighter bombers, heavy bombers, transports, reconnaissance planes. Over 14,000 sorties flown in a single day. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties across all of France. On D-Day, the Allies had 46 aircraft for every one German plane in the sky. It was not a battle, it was an equation. As the landing craft approached, Pluscat continued watching. He never forgot the detail that broke him. The ships did not hesitate. Destroyers advanced aggressively toward the shore. Landing craft crashed directly into the waves. Transports lined up in perfect sequence. To German observers, this behavior was madness. Warships were precious. Landing craft were limited. Transports were irreplaceable. But the Allies behaved as if nothing was irreplaceable, because in practical terms, nothing was. If they lost 10 ships, they had dozens more. If they lost hundreds of landing craft, they could build hundreds within days. Germany could not comprehend such abundance, and on that morning, they saw it laid bare in front of them. Several German officers later wrote, "It was the moment we understood we had already lost. We realized our war was over before the first soldier set foot on the beach. The horizon killed our hopes." This realization spread through the German defenders like a quiet sickness, unspoken, undeniable. Even as the invasion unfolded before their eyes, many German commanders refused to believe it. Why? Because they believed the real invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais. Allied deception, Operation Fortitude, had convinced them of this. Fake signals, inflatable tanks, entire phantom armies under the supposed command of General Patton, false communication networks. The deception was so successful that Hitler and his staff refused to release Panzer reserves for days after D-Day. Even when reports from Normandy became desperate, they believed it was all a trick, an attempt to draw their forces away from the real landing. This strategic blindness meant the strongest German armored divisions never reached Normandy in time. They were frozen in place by nothing more than Allied imagination and German overconfidence. Pluskat, Omsen, and every officer along the cliffs fought without hope of reinforcement. They knew they were alone. As the landing craft prepared to hit the beaches, the Germans braced for the coming impact. They believed their fortifications, interlocking machine gun nests, mortars, anti-tank guns, might hold. Perhaps they could stall the first wave. Perhaps they could buy time before the second wave arrived. But as daybreak fully arrived, they saw the truth. The waves would not stop. There were no intervals, no pauses, no breaks. It was a conveyor belt of men and machines, fed by a logistical system so powerful that even German officers could not comprehend it. They would later write, "We tried to count the landing craft, but their numbers were beyond counting." It was a continuous stream that never ended. It felt as if the sea itself was creating them. And in those final seconds before the ramps dropped and the first Americans ran into the surf, a chilling silence fell over the German defenders. Not because the battlefield was quiet, but because they finally understood they were witnessing the future. The German officers on the cliffs did not yet know how Normandy would unfold. They did not know about the destroyers that would close to 1,000 yards of Omaha beach. They did not know about the Mulberry harbors that would be built within days. They did not know about the 2.5 million men and 3.9 million tons of supplies that would land in France by August, but they sensed the deeper truth. The war would not be decided by courage or will or ideology. It would be decided by industrial output. D-Day was the moment that truth became visible. An armada of steel stretched across the channel, making abstract numbers real. Pluskat lowered his binoculars. Omsen steadied himself. Across Normandy, German officers watched their assumptions crumble. Everything they believed, everything they had been promised, everything the regime had taught them, died that morning when the sea turned black with ships. It was not just the beginning of the end. It was the revelation of why the end was inevitable. By 6 a.m., the transformation of the Normandy coastline was complete. The sea no longer carried reflections of dawn. Instead, it carried the fierce white flashes of naval guns. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed a torrent of fire that shook the very cliffs the Germans were defending. Inside the concrete bunkers, the air changed. Dust trembled in the seams of the walls. Metal vibrated in the hands of machine gunners. Even breaths came in uneven rhythms, broken not by fear, but by the sheer physical pressure of thousands of tons of explosives detonating across the shoreline. Oberleutnant Walter Omsen's battery opened fire first. His 210-millimeter guns spat enormous shells that arced over the water, leaving black trails behind them. When one struck near the USS Corey, a column of water rose higher than the ship itself. Yet even the sinking of Corey, the only American destroyer lost that morning, made no difference. For every ship hit, 100 moved forward without hesitation. Major Pluskat saw the lanes of landing craft forming. They separated cleanly from their motherships, moved into perfect lines, and advanced straight toward the beaches. They moved with the precision of factory machinery. Nothing in German doctrine accounted for this. The water behind them churned white with thousands of propellers. The water ahead of them turned black with the shadows of naval fire. And still they came. From every observation slit, German soldiers saw the same thing. Landing craft advancing in waves that never seemed to end. LCVPS, LCAs, LCTS bearing tanks. Amphibious trucks pushing over the waves like strange, lumbering creatures. Severlo, stationed at WN62, pressed his eye to the narrow firing slit of his machine gun nest. He had never seen the ocean before coming to Normandy. But now, even if he had, this was not an ocean. It was a battlefield carried on water. The landing craft approached with terrifying consistency. If one was destroyed, the crafts behind it simply swerved and continued the advance. The formation behaved less like individual vessels and more like a single organism composed of thousands of moving parts. Severlo whispered to the soldier beside him, "They are not stopping. They are not even slowing down." The other man said nothing. The truth was already clear. The enemy was not operating at the scale of human decision. They were operating at the scale of industrial momentum. The moment the ramp slammed down, the world changed. Hundreds of American soldiers leapt into the freezing surf. The water was chest deep. Heavy packs dragged them down. The weight of rifles, ammunition, and gear fought against their attempt to move forward. Some disappeared immediately under the water, but more kept coming. German machine guns opened fire. MG-42s, fast, terrifying, brutally efficient, shredded the first ranks of men. The guns sounded like tearing metal, like entire sheets of steel being ripped apart in one violent pull. Within seconds, the beach was littered with bodies. Pluskat watched from above, his binoculars pressed hard to his face. The horror unfolding below was so intense that even he, a veteran of the Eastern Front, felt his mind lock for a moment. He had seen carnage in Russia, frozen corpses stacked like firewood, but nothing like this chaotic, immediate massacre on open sand. And yet, the Americans did not break. They did not fall back. They pressed on. For every man who died, 2 more landed behind him. This, the Germans would later write, was the moment they realized something even worse than the scale of the invasion. The Americans seemed inexhaustible. Severlo's MG-42 roared without pause. He fired 250-round belts until the metal burned his gloves. Smoke wrapped around him. Shell casings piled at his feet in glittering heaps. His assistant gunner shouted distances, directions, corrections. But the targets never thinned. They crawled, fell, rose again. Some used the bodies of the dead as cover. Some dug shallow holes with their bare hands. Some simply kept running, without any chance of survival. The machine gun nest shook under the impact of naval shells landing nearby. Each explosion felt like the entire bunker had been picked up and slammed back down again. A soldier near Severlo screamed as shrapnel tore through his shoulder. Another collapsed from concussion alone. But none of them left their posts. They knew the truth. If they fell back, the beach would be lost within minutes. By 7 a.m., the American destroyers began making a decision that defied both German expectations and German logic. They moved closer, closer still. Some destroyers advanced to within 1,000 yards of the beach. Some came even closer, their hulls scraping underwater sandbars. Their guns now firing at near point-blank range, aimed directly at individual German bunkers. USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, USS Frankfurt. Their 5-inch shells detonated with merciless accuracy. Entire sections of the cliff exploded outward. German machine gun positions vanished in fireballs of sand and stone. Concrete walls, meters thick, cracked open like shells. Pluskat stared through his optics, stunned. They are using their ships as assault guns. This was unheard of. Destroyers were not meant to risk grounding. They were not meant to expose themselves to shore batteries. They were not expendable assets. Yet the Americans treated them as if they were disposable. Because in a way, they were. America had hundreds more. Germany had none to spare. This was not just bravery. This was the confidence of a nation that could replace anything lost with astonishing speed. Around 8:30 a.m., American infantry reached the base of the bluffs. Against all odds, through fire that shredded entire platoons, small units found ways to climb. They followed bomb craters. They crawled up grassy slopes. They scaled rocks slick with seawater. They used Bangalore torpedoes to breach wire. They found dead ground where German guns could not reach. The German defenders watched in disbelief. This was not a uniform advance. This was not textbook. This was not clean. It was raw, desperate, individual bravery, multiplied by the thousands. And it worked. A single American squad breached a wire obstacle, then another, then another. A trickle became a stream became a surge. By 9 a.m., German fire began to falter, not because their courage failed, but because ammunition ran low. Machine guns overheated. Mortars were gone. Bunkers were breached one by one. Pluscat could only whisper, "They are inside our defenses." By late morning, the German defensive line at Omaha was no longer a line. It was a collection of isolated pockets, firing in different directions, unsure what was happening on either side of them. Some bunkers still fought with fanatic determination. Some were destroyed by direct hits from destroyers. Some were overrun by grenades and close quarters fighting. The radios crackled with panic. WN-62 surrounded. WN-64 overrun. Requesting reinforcements, none available. Artillery destroyed, we cannot support. Air attack, air attack, air attack. Every request met only static. The Luftwaffe did not appear. Panzer reserves did not arrive. Rommel was still hundreds of kilometers away. Hitler was asleep. Germany fought blind, deaf, and alone. By midday, Omaha was no longer a battlefield. It was becoming a logistical base. DUKWS rolled ashore in convoys. Shermans emerged from LCTS like mechanical beasts rising from the sea. Engineers cleared obstacles, laid trackways, and dug gun pits. Artillery batteries were set up directly on the sand. In hours, the Americans transformed a killing ground into a functioning port. Pluscat, watching all of this, understood the final truth. You cannot stop an enemy who can replace everything faster than you can destroy it. No amount of bravery could defend against an army backed by factories. No tactical brilliance could overcome a force supplied with mathematical precision. The turning point of D-Day was not when the Americans reached the bluffs. It was not when the destroyers closed in. It was not when the machine guns fell silent. The true turning point was the realization, in the minds of every German officer present, that the war had already been lost. They saw it. They felt it. Not through ideology, not through propaganda, not through reports, but with their own eyes. They saw industrial production made visible. They saw an army that could not be stopped because it could not be exhausted. They saw a war machine that had no single point of failure. The turning point was the moment their worldview shattered. The United States was not a weak, decadent nation. It was a superpower of steel. As the sun climbed higher, American soldiers climbed the bluffs. They planted footholds, raised rifles, advanced inland. Behind them, the sea churned with more landing craft. Behind those landing craft were still more. Behind them, ships. Behind the ships, shipyards. Behind the shipyards, factories. Behind the factories, an entire nation mobilized for total war. And from the shattered bunkers, the German defenders finally understood. They were not fighting soldiers. They were fighting statistics. They were fighting production numbers. They were fighting an enemy whose strength lay not in men, but in the machines that carried them. D-Day was not just a battle. It was the moment the modern world revealed what war had become. By late morning on June 6th, the Normandy coastline no longer resembled a battlefield governed by rules or structure. It had devolved into something far more primal, an environment where order collapsed and survival replaced strategy. The Germans defending the bluffs were no longer soldiers holding a line. They were isolated fragments of a braking system, each trapped inside pockets of violence they could not escape. For the Americans below, the beach was not a landing zone. It was a gauntlet. Every inch of sand was marked by the imprint of explosions, crater beside crater, wreckage beside wreckage. Bodies washed ashore, carried back by the tide, then thrust forward again. The smell of salt water mixed with gasoline. The air trembled with the ongoing roar of naval guns. And somewhere within that constant detonation, voices rose, shouting orders, calling for medics, screaming for help that could not come quickly enough. A young American lieutenant, crawling behind a metal obstacle half buried in the sand, shouted at his men to keep moving. Machine gun fire tore the air in front of him in long, merciless streams. He pressed his helmet into the sand and felt grains grinding against his teeth as he clenched his jaw. When he lifted his head, he could no longer see the squad he had led off the landing craft. Most were gone, lost in the first brutal minute. This was not a coordinated advance, it was survival in motion. Behind him, a medic sprinted through the chaos with a satchel of bandages, ducking low, weaving between obstacles. A round struck him in the side. He folded instantly, fell to one knee and tried to rise. Another round hit him, and he collapsed completely, disappearing behind a wave that washed red from the surf. To the German defenders, watching from the heights, the beach looked like a scene from another world, somewhere between nightmare and the end of all things. And they understood, if this force could survive this, then nothing could stop it. In the bunkers carved into the cliffs, the situation was worsening by the minute. Ventilation fans failed. Air grew thick with the smell of burnt powder. The heat of nonstop firing made machine guns glow red. Belts of ammunition jammed under the strain. Gunners ripped them free with burned hands, their gloves smoldering. Severlo's fingers were blistered raw. He had been firing his MG-42 for hours, stopping only long enough to switch barrels or reload. The recoil pounded his shoulder again and again, bruising bone. His assistant gunner shouted corrections through the narrow slit, but the noise outside drowned out most words. When shells from destroyers detonated nearby, dust cascaded from cracks in the concrete ceiling, drifting like gray snow over the gun crew. The blast waves slammed against the bunker walls so violently that several of the younger soldiers clutched their helmets in panic. A radio operator frantically tapped messages, trying to reach regimental headquarters. Only static answered him. Artillery support? Nothing. Air support? Nothing. Reinforcements? Silence. Every German position knew they were alone. The chain of command was broken. The plan, whatever remained of it, no longer existed. They were isolated defenders in a collapsing world. War is not only the destruction of bodies, it is the destruction of certainty. For many German soldiers, that psychological breaking point arrived not when the Americans reached the bluffs, but earlier, when they realized the waves of landing craft simply did not end. A soldier in WN-64 lowered his binoculars, trembling. I thought we were fighting the first wave, he whispered, but the first wave has no end. Another watched the sky fill with aircraft, wave after wave, the sound so constant it felt like a physical weight pressing on his helmet. They have more planes than we have bullets. Inside an anti-tank gun emplacement, a gunner tried to steady himself as a 14-inch naval shell landed in a nearby field. The explosion tore an entire hedgerow out of the ground. He stared at the crater, realizing it was big enough to swallow the gun carriage whole. How do you fight this? He asked. No one answered. These were not men lacking courage. They were veterans of the Eastern Front, survivors of Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kursk. But even they were shaken by what they saw on this beach. Not because the Americans were better soldiers, but because the Americans had created a battlefield powered by an entire nation's industry. Courage could not compete with that. Skill could not compete with that. Willpower could not compete with that. This was an enemy that could not be depleted. For the Americans, the suffering was almost beyond comprehension. At the waterline, hundreds of men lay wounded, trying to crawl forward only to be dragged back by the surf. Some drowned within feet of safety. Others clung to anti-tank obstacles, gasping as bullets snapped through the air around them. A sergeant grabbed a private by the back of his gear, hauling him behind a metal hedgehog. The private's face was gray with shock, his helmet missing, eyes wide. "Move!" the sergeant shouted. "I can't!" the private whispered. His leg was gone below the knee. The sergeant dragged him behind a small dune, then sprinted forward with a grenade in each hand. He never made it 10 steps. A mortar round dropped near him, leaving nothing but smoke and torn sandbags. For those who reached the base of the cliffs, the challenge only increased. The slopes were steep, muddy, and exposed. Bullets ricocheted off rocks. Grenades rolled down toward them. Body after body tumbled back as soldiers lost their grip. Yet they continued to climb. It was not bravery alone. It was the knowledge that stopping meant dying on the beach. Every man who climbed did so because the only alternative was to be swallowed by the surf or cut down where he lay. And somehow, against all odds, they kept rising from the chaos. On the bluffs, German defenders began hearing something new. American voices coming from angles where no Americans should be. Grenades landing inside trenches that were supposed to be unreachable. Boots scraping against rocks at the edges of their vision. A squad of Americans reached a small gap in the wire. They pushed through. Another squad followed. A third emerged from a shell crater that overlooked a machine gun nest from behind. A German corporal fired desperately at shadows moving through the smoke. He emptied his magazine, reloaded, and fired again. But no matter how many he killed, more appeared. He shouted into the bunker, "They are behind us!" The officer inside froze. Behind? That was impossible. The cliffs were supposed to be impassable. The beach was supposed to be a killing ground. No assault was supposed to survive long enough to reach the bluffs. But the Americans did not fight according to German assumptions. They fought according to necessity. They adapted in seconds. They used smoke, terrain, debris, even corpses as cover. They treated the battlefield not like a rigid plan, but like a puzzle they could solve one fragment at a time. By midday, infiltration turned into breakthrough. A single American platoon reached the top of the bluffs near a key junction point. Once that high ground fell, the entire German coastal defense system began to unravel. The German positions no longer connected to one another. A bunker that was supposed to support another bunker could no longer fire without hitting friendly troops. Machine gun nests that were designed as overlapping fields of fire now found themselves surrounded. At WN62, Severlo looked through the firing slit and saw American soldiers climbing the slope directly below the bunker. He swung the MG-42 downward, but the angle was too steep. He could not depress the barrel far enough. A grenade landed near the entrance. The blast knocked a soldier unconscious. Shrapnel tore into the radio operator. Shouting echoed from the rear tunnel. "They're inside! They're in the trenches!" Severlo grabbed his rifle, leaving the MG-42 behind. He ran into the connecting trench where American soldiers were already advancing. The fighting became hand-to-hand. Bayonets, rifle butts, knives, fists. Men grappled in the narrow corridors, slipping on blood, choking on dust. This was no longer D-Day. This was no longer an amphibious landing. This was a series of individual battles, every meter contested by men fighting not for territory, but for the next breath of air. By the time American forces fully overran WN62, the German defenders were either dead, wounded, or retreating deeper inland. Severlo was among the few who managed to escape, slipping out through a communication trench before the Americans flooded the position. He stumbled through smoke, ears ringing, uniform torn. Behind him, the bunker he had defended for hours, where he had fired over 12,000 rounds, was now a silent, shattered ruin. Machine gun nests that had once controlled the beach with terrifying effectiveness were now twisted metal and broken concrete. The corridors that had echoed with orders were now filled with bodies, empty shells, and drifting smoke. He turned once more to look back. The beach he had tried to defend was now filled with American vehicles. Supplies were being unloaded. Engineers were marking new paths. The tide, which had washed away so many lives in the morning, now carried crates, fuel cans, and ammunition boxes. It was no longer a German-held coastline. It was the first foothold of a new world. By late afternoon, the fighting had moved inland. The hell of the morning had transformed into a different kind of nightmare. Close-quarter ambushes in hedgerows, mortar duels across farm fields, sniper fire from church towers. American forces moved steadily, building momentum with every meter gained. German forces fell back toward defensive points that no longer existed on any functioning map. The roads became clogged with retreating units, wounded soldiers, and supply carts. Air attacks came without warning, scattering columns with each explosive burst. Inside every German officer's mind, one thought repeated, "We have no reserves. We have no air. We have no way to stop them." On their maps, Normandy was supposed to be a wall. In reality, it had become a sieve, one that could no longer hold. As night approached, a strange quiet settled over the battlefield. Not peace, not calm, but the pause between two storms. The Germans were exhausted. The Americans were regrouping. The dead lay where they had fallen. Stretchers moved among them. Medics worked by fading light, sometimes treating friend and foe alike. From the cliffs, the sea glowed faintly under the last traces of daylight. Hundreds of ships remained, steady and immovable, their silhouettes black against the horizon. The sight broke the last remaining resistance within many German minds. This was not the tide turning. This was the tide revealing its full depth. The defenders who survived that day understood something that would haunt them for decades. They had not lost the Battle of Normandy on land. They had lost it in the moment they saw the ocean filled with ships. By the end of June 6th, the Americans held the bluffs. But victory on D-Day did not bring stability. It brought a new form of chaos, one that stretched across the hedgerows, through the villages, and into the heart of the German command structure itself. The Germans had once imagined Normandy as a single defensive line. Now it was a broken mosaic of shattered companies, cut-off platoons, and isolated strongpoints fighting with no sense of a larger picture. Maps no longer mattered. Roads no longer mattered. The cohesive structure of an army had dissolved under pressure it was never meant to withstand. At command posts inland, German officers tried desperately to assemble a coherent understanding of the situation, but every report contradicted the last one. Units that reported their positions in the morning no longer existed by afternoon. Supply lines that had taken years to build were severed in hours. General Marx attempted to rally the remnants of his corps. He had survived Stalingrad, believed in discipline, trusted in training. But when he received confirmation that American forces had broken through the bluffs and were moving inland, he said quietly, "This is not a breach. This is a collapse in slow motion." He was right. Germany still possessed its most feared weapon, the Panzer divisions. SS units, armored grenadiers, veteran tank crews. These had once conquered Europe in weeks. The German command believed they could still turn the tide, but they never reached the battlefield in any meaningful strength. The reason was simple and devastating: air power. Every road leading toward Normandy became a corridor of death. Columns of German vehicles stalled under the constant assault of Allied fighter bombers. Jabos, P-47 Thunderbolts, swooped down with screaming engines, launching rockets into convoys, shredding trucks with .50 caliber fire, forcing entire divisions to scatter into fields and forests. Panzer troops who had once raced through France at lightning speed now found themselves grounded, hiding beneath trees while the war moved without them. A lieutenant from the 12th SS Panzer wrote, "We moved 10 kilometers in 3 hours. Half our vehicles burned before we reached the front. We fought the sky more than the Americans." And as the hours turned into days, one truth became brutally clear. Germany had tanks. It no longer had mobility. Industrial war had taken control of the battlefield. The struggle for Caen tested Germany's strongest divisions. The city that Montgomery hoped to take in one day became a crucible that lasted weeks. Panzerlehr, 12th SS Hitlerjugend, 21st Panzer, elite units, well-trained, confident, but they fought under skies they did not own. When British and Canadian forces approached Caen, the Germans resisted fiercely, turning every street into a barricade, every intersection into a defensive knot. Their infantry fought with determination. Their tanks counterattacked again and again. Yet it was all undone in a single evening. On July 7th, the RAF unleashed 467 heavy bombers on the city. In 40 minutes, over 2,500 tons of bombs fell. The ground shook as if the earth itself were splitting. Entire neighborhoods detonated into fireballs. German defensive lines ceased to exist. A soldier from the 12th SS wrote, "We did not fight the enemy. We were buried." The bombing was not a battle. It was industrial demolition, removing a city from the battlefield so the infantry could advance on level ground. For the Germans trapped inside, this was the moment when hope died. Through July, the German army fought with incredible tenacity. They counterattacked with what armor they had left. They dug in behind hedgerows that functioned like natural fortresses. They improvised ambushes that inflicted heavy losses on the advancing Americans. But with every day that passed, their army resembled its former strength less and less. Divisions that had entered Normandy with 17,000 men and 150 tanks. Full artillery regiments, so now counted, 3,000 survivors. A handful of tanks. Almost no functioning artillery. A logistics officer near Saint-Lô wrote, We had units still on the map that had ceased to exist. Their names remained. Their men were gone. The Germans were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to slow the inevitable. On July 25th, the Americans launched Operation Cobra, the breakout that would shatter the German line completely. It began with a bombardment so concentrated that many survivors believed the earth had caught fire. 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, 550 fighter bombers, all striking a narrow corridor where Panzerlehr had concentrated its remaining strength. The bombardment lasted minutes, not hours, but its impact was catastrophic. Entire companies disappeared in those minutes. Vehicles were hurled into trees. Men were killed without visible wounds, crushed by pressure alone. Communications broke. Morale broke. Structure broke. General Bayerlein of Panzerlehr reported, "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting soldiers. We are fighting an industrial machine." For the German command, this was not defeat, this was deletion. As the Allies closed in from north and south, tens of thousands of German troops became trapped in a shrinking pocket near the town of Falaise. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The narrow corridors became jammed with retreating vehicles. Artillery rained down from every direction. Allied aircraft filled the sky, attacking anything that moved. Panzers, half-tracks, armored cars, staff cars, and wagons clogged the roads in a single desperate mass. Smoke, fire, screams, the smell of burning oil mixed with the smell of burning flesh. German officers described the scene as the end of the army. By the time the pocket collapsed, 10,000 to 15,000 German soldiers were dead. 40,000 to 50,000 were captured. 344 tanks and assault guns were destroyed. Over 2,400 vehicles abandoned. 252 artillery pieces lost. Those who escaped were not units. They were survivors, broken, scattered remnants with no cohesion and almost no weapons. Normandy had consumed the fighting strength of the German West. After Normandy, German officers privately admitted something they could not say aloud during the war. The defeat was not tactical, it was mathematical. Allied production dwarfed their efforts. American shipyards could build more vessels in a month than Germany could destroy in a year. American factories produced more trucks in 1 year than Germany produced in the entire war. Speidel wrote, "We had counted divisions. They counted factories." Blumentritt said, "We prepared for a contest of soldiers. We faced a contest of economies." The ideology drilled into them for years collapsed under the weight of a single undeniable truth. War was no longer a test of will, it was a test of industry. On June 6, 1984, Walter Olmsen, now an elderly man of 73, stood once again at the Chris Battery. He looked out at the same water where he had seen nearly 7,000 ships advancing. The sea was calm now, a pale silver in the morning light. Veterans from both sides stood with him, some in uniform, some in civilian coats, all carrying memories heavier than metals. Olmsen spoke softly. 40 years ago, I saw the impossible, a sea covered with ships. Not water, only steel." He paused, his voice trembling, not with emotion, but with recognition. "I understood then that everything we had been told was wrong. Weak nations do not build such fleets. Divided nations do not attempt such an invasion." He looked down at the ground, then at the faces around him. "I fired my guns at that armada. It was like throwing stones at the tide." A veteran from the American Navy stepped forward, placing a hand on Olmsen's arm. "We were boys," he said. "We didn't understand the scale either." Olmsen nodded. "No soldier understood it. Only the factories did." For the German officers who survived Normandy, the campaign became a symbol, not of failure, but of transformation. They realized that the war they had trained for was gone. The war they had believed in was obsolete. The future belonged to nations that could harness industrial power on a scale never before imagined. The invasion fleet had shown this truth in a single morning. A horizon filled with ships revealing the new face of warfare. Industry, logistics, production, capacity, endurance, not courage, not ideology, not promises of a 1,000-year empire. The war had been decided before the first Allied soldier set foot on the sand. Decided in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, in British shipyards, in Canadian factories, in the thousands of hands that forged the steel of an entire fleet. Normandy merely made visible what had already been true. The war was not lost on the beaches. It was lost in the arithmetic behind them.